Hello, I'm Anavultus, and today I wanted to show you something very special, something that took me a little bit of time to make, but I think it's very interesting, and that is the history of the world's most powerful rulers. So, that is to say, in each period in history, you could estimate that a particular ruler of a certain country would be the world's most powerful. That is to say, more powerful than any other ruler at that time in the world. And the way I did this was based on a number of different factors: economics, military, population, force projection. There's a number of different metrics that come into this, including geographic positioning. And of course, this is not an exact science, this is an opinion. However, I try to make my opinion make quite a bit of sense so that anybody objecting to them would have to at least admit that there's some validity to what I am saying. So, anyway, the way I went about doing this is I went from the present to the past, and and I've noted a few different metrics here. So the time frame. So these are the years in which this person would be the most powerful ruler. The name and title of that ruler. The polity or the country or political entity that this person was leading. How this person got to be the most powerful ruler, and how this person ceased to be the most powerful ruler. Now, I will mention that the farther back we go, it's a little bit more difficult to gain a lot of historical records of a lot of medieval and ancient events, because sometimes they simply aren't written down, or they might be written down many decades later, or archaeologists have differing opinions about what they find. So it becomes a bit difficult to ascertain certain things, or even certain years in which things happened, the farther back you go. And for this reason, among others, I decided to stop at 745 BC. The reason for this is that this is that time period, 8th century BC, is when a lot of new empires started developing, because some centuries earlier there had been the Bronze Age collapse, and before that there's a time period in which it's a bit easier to ascertain who would be the most powerful, because there's a lot more historical records in that period. However, when the Bronze Age collapse happened, a lot of countries fell apart, and then there was a dark age in many parts of the world, until new powers started emerging again. And the reason why I chose 745 BC as the starting point here is because it is at this point that I think it can be said unambiguously that Assyria was the most powerful country in the world, and therefore its ruler would be the most powerful ruler in the world at the time. Because before that, it could be a bit more debatable, where Egypt wasn't doing too well because it's the third intermediate period. But there were certainly powerful people in Egypt. In lower Mesopotamia, there was a kingdom. The Elamites were around, and you have Urartu in the north, and arguably the pre-imperial China was sometimes more united, but at this point in history it was fragmenting more. I think this is the spring and autumn period entering into the Warring States period, in the Zhou Dynasty of China. So I think at this point, what the actions of Tigalov Pilser III, or in a more native dialect, Tukulti Apil Eshara, what he did was he defended Assyria against a number of rebellions, and then he expanded it in all directions pretty much. He's mentioned in the Bible as the Assyrian king that conquered the king of Israel, the kingdom of Israel. Um, and so I think at this point, unambiguously, he would have been the most powerful, considering the weakness of Egypt and China at the time, and of the surrounding neighbors of Assyria. It can be said that Assyria was the most powerful country. So he ended a number of rebellions and conquered Babylonia, that is to say, Lower Mesopotamia. And then he died. At which point he was succeeded by another member of his dynasty. However, ultimately there was a rebellion in Babylonia after the death of Shalmaneser, and at this point, it can be argued that Assyria without Lower Mesopotamia is significantly weaker than Assyria with Lower Mesopotamia, because Lower Mesopotamia had a large population and an agricultural yield, and therefore it is very economically important. And therefore, the alternative to Assyria, that is to say, the country that would be the most powerful when Assyria is in one of its weak periods, would have to be Egypt. But in this case, it's not Egypt, actually, because it's Kush, because the kings of Kush had conquered Egypt and had begun what is referred to as the 25th dynasty of Egypt. And so they controlled from a region in Sudan all the way up through Egypt, and can be said to have been one of the more powerful dynasties of Egypt in this time period. And Kush has a very interesting history. It was very heavily influenced by Egypt. Lower Kush, or the more northern part that's closer to Egypt, obviously was more influenced than Upper Kush, or the southerly portion of Kush. And the kings of Kush portrayed themselves as defenders of Egyptian culture and civilization when they entered and took over from the more weaker quarreling dynasties that existed in Egypt at the time. Because although Egypt had survived the Bronze Age collapse, it had declined significantly, and it had begun fragmenting in the Third Intermediate period. But eventually, Assyria reconquered Babylonia under Sargon II, who built his new capital, Dur-Sharrukin, which was eventually abandoned, but it's an interesting place, an interesting archaeological site to look at. But the Assyrians, because they were living in a flat land next to mountains with river connections, they were in a relatively indefensible position. So as part of their policy, they essentially engaged in constant warfare, attacking in all directions. And that, of course, made them very disliked. And they also had some very cruel policies towards some defeated enemies, which brought fear to their enemies, but also ensured that people would think twice before opposing the Assyrians. Now, the Assyrians, they did manage to conquer most of the flatland regions of the Fertile Crescent. A lot of the more mountainous regions, they had a sort of semi control over those regions because they might get tribute from them. But if they didn't get tribute, they would then launch military campaigns. For example, they would attack the Elamites, the Medes, the people of Urartu, And for example, from the Medes, they would want horses because horses at this time period were becoming more important in warfare. And not that they hadn't been because chariots were around, but in this time period, people started having more horseback riding cavalry, even though chariots were still common. But the ability to ride horses offered a new versatility in warfare. But anyway, I would say that typically speaking, in this time period, Assyria was stronger than Kush when it controlled Babylonia and weaker than it when it did not. And that's why I have the kings of Assyria and the kings of Kush trading off as time passes. And eventually the Assyrians managed to subjugate the Elamites to some extent, although some portions of the Elamite territory would eventually be taken by the Persians. And that's why the early capital of Persia was Anshan, which was one of the capitals of the Elamites. But eventually, the Assyrians entered into a decline because they suffered another major rebellion in Babylonia, this time led by Nabopolassar, who is more important later. But they eventually also suffered foreign invasions by the Medes and other powers. Although the Scythians had been powerful for some time and had been raiding into the Middle East and even had been receiving tribute from Egypt, they weren't as powerful anymore. And the Medes, who had for some time period been subjugated by the Scythians, or the Scythians, as some might say, eventually had overpowered them and were becoming a power in their own right when they were taking control of various areas of the Iranian plateau. So the Medes and the Babylonians, among others, or the Chaldeans, being the inhabitants of Babylonia at the time, or at least the ruling class in Babylonia at the time, managed to successfully attack Assyria and eventually destroyed their capital. So in that time period where there was a struggle between the Assyrians and the Babylonians or Chaldeans, I would say that Egypt during the late period now was the most powerful. But eventually Babylon managed to consolidate control over all of Mesopotamia and a lot of Assyria's former territory, at which point I can say that Babylonia would be the most powerful under King Nabopolassar and then his son Nebuchadnezzar, who famously is portrayed in the Bible. But anyway, the Chaldeans eventually declined, and their Neo-Babylonian Empire declined, and it can be argued that in the last days of their empire, they had been overshadowed by the power of the Persians, or particularly the Achaemenid dynasty, led by Cyrus the Great. And I would argue that this happened at around the time when Cyrus conquered Lydia, which was a kingdom in Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey, which was known very much for its wealth, as previously Phrygia, another kingdom in that region, had been known for their wealth. And this area is associated with very wealthy people in history and legend. So, for example, you have King Midas, who was a Phrygian king, and also King Croesus, who was the Lydian king, who was associated as being extremely wealthy. So, at this point in history, the Persian Empire extended throughout much of the Iranian plateau, into the Armenian plateau and also into Anatolia, and therefore was significantly larger than the Babylonian Empire, but arguably perhaps not as economically strong, because Babylon, of course, retained control of Mesopotamia, a very important agricultural region. But ultimately, when push came to shove, the Persian military was significantly stronger than the Babylonian military. And there was a lot of experimentation with siege warfare in this time period. So the armies of Cyrus the Great were well known for being able to capture cities, which was siege technology was already being developed earlier, and the Assyrians were certainly users of it. But it can be argued that the Persians really made some great advancements in that field. But anyway, the Persians had some dynastic struggles, but in their time, they controlled a much larger portion of the world's population than arguably any other empire subsequent to theirs, which could mean that arguably at their peak, under Xerxes and Artaxerxes, the Persians might be considered the most powerful empire of all time. And the name of their empire translates simply as the empire or the realm, which is interesting because it doesn't make reference to other things as some other kingdoms might have. For example, the Assyrians were not only kings of Assyria, but were also kings of Sumer and Akkad, and they used another title which some people translate as king of the universe or king of everything, and this was common in Mesopotamian dynasties. But it's interesting that they just simply said, we have an empire and it's this realm, and it controls more than anything else, and therefore is the world's largest empire at the time. But anyway, the Persians ruled for some time. They had some dynastic struggles, some assassinations, but ultimately they were conquered by Alexander the Great. And this is one of the few events in history where people have to solidly admit that there was a single individual that had a massive impact on history. Because if you don't know, there's a number of different theories about history and how forces work in history. For example, there's a theory that everything is driven through cultural trends, that therefore great leaders emerge as a result of certain cultures, and that therefore certain cultures lead to inevitable movements towards certain things or towards certain disasters or advantages. And another theory that says that history is primarily led by heroic forces, that there are individuals that rise to the challenge of history and that really have an impact, and that these individuals then have the power to entirely reshape the cultures that they interact with. But I think truly it is a combination of the two, that there are general cultural, social trends that lead towards certain things, but in the powerful people that they might produce, those people, through their power, have the opportunity to change things significantly. And Alexander the Great is certainly one of the individuals that did this, because he certainly was an individual that rose above the cultural expectations that might be had for him, because he didn't simply protect the Greek city-states as some might have expected him to do, or expand the Macedonian or Macedonian realm in Europe and maybe parts of Asia. He went and he conquered as much as he could, and he wanted to conquer more, but ultimately, not everybody else in his army wanted to conquer more. But anyway, I say the turning point in between these two powers, between Persia and Macedonia, would be the Battle of Gaugamela, after which Alexander managed to take control of Mesopotamia, the economic and administrative center of the empire, and also the last king of kings of Persia, Darius III, escaped and ultimately was killed by one of his own generals. And by the way, the reason why some names are in parentheses is because I tried to look at more authentic spellings of the names of some of these individuals, and then I also put the mainstream names and ordinals in the parentheses, because historically speaking, most rulers didn't put a number by their name. That's something that didn't happen very frequently historically. But anyway, Alexander the Great, despite the conquests and him taking over part of the Persian bureaucracy, after his death, the empire really had a hard time keeping it together. And I was debating on who to put on here, because I try to put typically the official leaders of a country, even if they aren't wielding the power, if they technically have the power, if they have, for example, let's say a royal prerogative. In the case of later on, we're going to be talking about the British monarchs, where even today, technically speaking, they have a royal prerogative, and even if they don't use it and they aren't expected to use a royal prerogative to take a more direct action in the government, they still have the perfectly legal ability to do so. And this is the case in a lot of cases where somebody might be in charge, but somebody else is the monarch, and technically, under, let's say, a constitutional model, would have more power, but that's not always directly the case, as we might see. In this case, I decided to instead put the regents of the Macedonians in this time period. And the reason I put them instead of the actual kings, which would be Alexander's half-brother Philip and his son, also called Alexander, is because not only did those two individuals have very little power, even though they were technically the official rulers, the empire itself was fragmenting politically. And the regents themselves were considered the commanders-in-chief of the military, but ultimately they ended up having a number of civil wars. For example, Perdiccas, I would argue that when he died, he still had the most powerful position as regent, even though the empire was in civil war, because he controlled Mesopotamia and the eastern satrapies. But after he died, there was some questions over who would become the next regent, and the satraps of the empire got together, and they picked a couple of people, but ultimately Antipater decided to become the new regent, and even before he officially became the regent, he was the dominant force in the empire at the time. And then when he died, Polyperchon became the regent, but Antipater's son wasn't happy with that, and that caused another civil war. At which point, I would say that officially the Macedonian Empire never really recovered the unity that it had before that, and really was no longer able to compete in a direct sense. And soon afterwards, both of the kings were killed, uh, and the most powerful remaining rulers of various provinces, the satraps, declared themselves kings. For example, you have the Seleucids, you have the Antigonids, you've got the Ptolemies. There's a king in Pergamon, etc. But anyway, during this time period, during these civil wars that happened, that ultimately broke apart the unity of this great empire, I would say that in India, the Maurya dynasty, led by Chandragupta, became the most powerful. Uh, and the two reasons for that is, of course, there was a massive civil war in the larger empire to the west, but also after after defeating the previous dynasty in Magadha, Chandragupta not only took over the kingdom, but he expanded it significantly and even began invading the easternmost parts of that were being ruled by the Greeks. However, he ultimately managed to come to a peaceful settlement with the Seleucids, and at that point, Seleucus went over to the to the west because he was fighting in the east, and he won the Battle of Ipsus and managed to consolidate control of the largest of these empires, of the successors of Alexander. And so it can be said that he and eventually his successor, Antiochus, were the most powerful in the world at the time, even though the Mauryas were also very powerful at the same time. And I would argue they would be in second place, a very close second place, and they also had friendly relations with each other during this time period. But eventually, I would say that the Mauryas overcame them in power once they had completed their conquest of Kalinga, making them one of the largest empires in Indian history, which is very interesting. But ultimately, under Ashoka, but ultimately when he died, it's hard to tell because there's not a lot of historical records of the Maurya Empire. There seems to have been a political fragmentation. And due to the weakness of the Seleucids in this time period, I put the Ptolemies in Egypt in the strongest position, under Ptolemy the Third and Ptolemy the Fourth. And Egypt, of course, had a very strong economy and also a very advanced bureaucratic system at the time. In fact, there are many ways in which ancient Egypt has similarities to more modern bureaucracies. And it can be truly said to have been a proper state, as historians would say, because there are many countries in history, but not all of them are considered proper states. And this is a more complex issue in relation to international politics and political science as to what exactly a state is. But I think Egypt at the time can certainly be said to have been a proper state. However, in this time period, the The Warring States period of China had been raging on, and ultimately China was united by Qin Shi Huangdi. By the way, I'm using English pronunciation for all of these, so or mostly English pronunciations. So if it's wrong, you know why. It's because these names were pronounced differently in English. Uh, and this means the first emperor of Qin is the literal translation of the name. I use Wang Di as the title for the Chinese emperors because there was some controversy over whether emperor would be an accurate translation of Wang Di, because Wang it can mean ruler or king, but Di has this divine element to it, so it's a divine ruler. Some people translate it as thearch, uh, from the Greek theos and archon. So uh, a divine ruler. But I just decided to keep it simple and just transliterate it Wang Di. So he united China, and the Qin dynasty was a very powerful dynasty that had developed a very robust bureaucracy under legalist policies, although arguably the misapplication of some of these policies ultimately led to a situation that caused a lot of disunity and also led to the Qin being remembered by future generations as tyrants. And although I would argue that some of this is probably historical revisionism, uh, because the Qin weren't very keen on Confucianism, unlike the Han, who eventually wrote the histories about the Qin. And so the Han accused the Qin of burying scholars alive and destroying Confucian literature. And while it could possibly be true in some cases, there's no real evidence that this actually happened. And also, we don't actually know the names of any of these scholars that were supposedly killed. So it's a bit of a questionable thing exactly how tyrannical the Qin were. However, they certainly were very uncompromising politically, and that led to a lot of problems. But ultimately, under the second emperor of Qin, the the Chinese had a major rebellion and civil war, which led to a more loosely organized Chinese political union for some time that eventually reconsolidated into the Han Dynasty. But during this time period, there was also a lot of disunity. So during this disunited period, I would argue that the Seleucids under Antiochus III, also known as the Great, but the reason why instead of putting the Great, I put Great King is because the reason he's called the Great is because he used a more ancient Mesopotamian title that translates as Great King. So once again, I try to somewhat standardize the titles, but in some cases I don't translate them, or I prefer to transliterate instead of translate. But ultimately, China reunified under the Han Dynasty, which was a very powerful dynasty under Gao or Gao Tzu of Han. Now, the reason why the names of the Chinese emperors here are in square brackets is because it became customary in China for emperors to not use personal names or regnal names in many cases, although there are a few exceptions. And typically, they were usually referred to by titles and honorifics while they were emperors, and received names after they died. And so for the names I put I typically use their posthumous names, although eventually they also have temple names. So if they're known more commonly by a different name, I put that name in the parentheses afterwards, as I do in other cases. But the Han Dynasty was very powerful militarily, very powerful economically, and so I can say that during this time period, they were easily the strongest in the world, as India at this time wasn't as powerful, and arguably there wasn't any country farther west that was particularly powerful. And I will mention at this point that there are no Amerindian rulers on this list, and there's a number of reasons for this. One of them is that they tended to be behind technologically compared to other powers in the so-called Old World, um, and and also by the time you end up with the largest Amerindian empires, there are empires in other parts of the world that are larger or more economically developed. So, for example, a lot of these countries, for example, the Romans, were not only powerful in their own right and in their own economy, but also through trade with other countries, such as the Persians and the Chinese, which are also on this list. So, because they are connected to a common trade network, it allows them to exchange technology, to exchange new practices, new ideas, and to develop economically together. And that brought them a lot of strength as time passed. But anyway, ultimately, there were some disruptions in Han power. So there was this brief civil war, at which point I put my only double list of names here, and that is Quintus Opimius and Lucius Postumius Albinus, who were both consuls in Rome at the time, and the Roman Republic, or the Senate and people of Rome, as one might say, had been expanding significantly in the Western Mediterranean, and were also beginning to expand in the Eastern Mediterranean, and therefore, at this point in history, I would say that they were more powerful than any of the Greek kingdoms. Although there are other kingdoms that were relatively powerful that didn't make it on the list, because I would argue that other countries were more powerful at the time. And those countries would be, for example, the Indo-Greeks and the Indo-Bactrians, who, sorry, not the Indo-Bactrians, the Indo-Greeks, the Greco-Bactrians, centered in regions of Afghanistan. They conquered a significantly large empire that was very successful economically. However, arguably, the Han rulers continue to be the most powerful. And I think what changes this for me is when the Romans finally conquered Egypt under Augustus, who would then become emperor later. Typically, the Roman emperors early on used a title princeps, which translates as first citizen, although eventually they would use other titles. For example, imperator was a title that was given to Octavius at the time. And it's interesting because he changed his name. His actual name is Imperator Kaiser Augustus. Imperator and Augustus are both titles that he received from the Senate, and Kaiser is the name of his adoptive father, Julius Caesar. So he ultimately abandoned his old name and renamed himself mostly using titles, which is interesting. But ultimately, here I would say that Han China and the Roman Empire were very strong in this time period, and they could arguably be considered very close to equal. However, I give the edge to the Roman Empire for a number of different reasons, for how they were organized militarily, for advantageous positioning because they had a greater access to trade with other large countries, which Han China did not, and they also had a large amount of gold coinage being produced in this time period. So I would say that there was also perhaps some technological advantages, although Han China was also technologically advanced as well. So I would say that they are very close. However, in this time period, I would argue that the Romans were stronger. And so when the Julio-Claudian dynasty ended and Rome had the year of 4 emperors, I would say that in this period, the Han were strong again under Xiaoming, Wang Di, and of course, then under the Flavians and eventually the 5 good emperors, Rome was relatively strong. I tried to put the full names of emperors. However, I had to pick sometimes between different names they used because Commodus, he changed his names a number of different times, and there was one time when it was really, really long. However, I ended up not using that one. I used one that he used more commonly. Ultimately, however, the Han Dynasty ended up declining and collapsing. And in that period, the Parthians were arguably the second strongest empires, although the Kushans, I think, were already around by this time period. However, I don't think that they were quite as strong as the Parthians. However, that's obviously something that's arguable. Although I think in this period, in this exact time period, the Kushans were perhaps weakening already. But ultimately, Rome managed to pull it back together under the Severan dynasty, although they didn't always have success. And after the death of Alexander Severus, they were led by Maximinus Thrax, and then the Senate had a rebellion against the emperor, which led to a brief civil war, during which I would say that the Sassanids would become the most powerful. So the Sassanids were a dynasty in Iran, and I think the name of their country at the time that they used was Iranshar, which means the Iranian Empire. I also put Sassanids in parentheses to clarify. So their first powerful ruler was Ardashir, but he eventually, I would say that the Sassanids at this point were not stronger than Rome. So whenever Rome was at peace, Rome would be stronger, but other than that, the Sassanids would be stronger when Rome was disunited. And we see this once again with Shapur and his successors during what is referred to as the crisis of the 3rd century in the Roman Empire, where eventually, although the Sassanids managed to invade the Roman Empire to some extent, Rome split into 3 separate countries that were eventually reunited under the Emperor Aurelian. However, unity did not last long, because after the death of his successor Tacitus, Rome once again went into civil war, during which point the Iranians were arguably the most powerful. And Rome had some instability moving forward. However, at this point, China reunified under the Qin Dynasty, which had succeeded the Wei Dynasty in northern China, and the Jin eventually conquered the other of the three kingdoms, because China was in the Three Kingdoms period during this range of around here, and they managed to unite China for some time, but it didn't last long, and there were a number of rebellions. I think they tried to invade Korea, but things just started to fall apart. And at that point, coincidentally, the Romans managed to pull things back together under the Emperor Diocletian, who established the Tetrarchy with his co-emperor Maximian. So in the case when when one country has two rulers, previously when I put the Roman Republic on here, I put them both because they technically had equal power. However, in the case of a tetrarchy, some people might not know this, but there typically was one emperor who was considered the senior Augustus as opposed to the other one. So in the case of Diocletian and Maximian, that was Diocletian. In the case of their successors, it was actually Constantius Chlorus, who ruled in the west, the western part of the empire. However, he died, and that caused some major disunity and civil war in the Roman Empire, at which point the Iranians under the Sassanids could be said once again to be the most powerful, with eventually one of their greatest rulers, Shapur II, or also known as Shapur the Great. However, the Romans reunified under Constantine. But then when he died, the empire was divided, and his sons killed any of their other relatives that they could in order to consolidate their own power, and they started working against each other. So it cannot be said that the empire was united at this time, the Roman Empire, that is. So Iran, once again, is the most powerful empire, until eventually Constantius II manages to reunite the Roman Empire. And, however, ultimately another civil war breaks out, and Shapur, once again, can be considered to be the strongest in the world, until Julian becomes the new emperor, and the empire remains somewhat stable, although it wasn't fully stable. There was always some problems. For example, Valens had a war with the Goths, and he died in battle or shortly after battle, and that put the Roman Empire into a crisis once again, at which point the Iranians would once again become the most powerful under Shapur. And his successor, Ardashir. But eventually, the Romans under Emperor Gratian managed to pull things together, but it wasn't always good. So there are some cases where they once again had civil war, and the Iranians could be said to be more powerful, and then the Romans, and then they had civil war again, and then the Romans, and then Theodosius the Great, when he died, the empire was divided between his two sons, and they seem to have not cooperated and gone their separate ways in a number of different ways, which led to the ultimate permanent division of the Roman Empire. After which point, I can say that the Iranians were certainly the most powerful in the world. However, eventually, the Iranians had some major civil war, which, after the death of Yazdegerd, which means that at this point, China was disunited. There wasn't any major united power in the Mediterranean, and Iran was disunited. So I would say that the Gupta Empire under Skanda Gupta would be the most powerful. Although he wasn't, he arguably wasn't the most powerful of the Gupta kings. He certainly would have been the most powerful in his time. And I would argue that the Gupta Empire wasn't as powerful as the unified Sassanids or the unified Roman Empire or the unified Chinese in this time period, because they were, although they were very well developed philosophically and had a very strong economy, I don't think that their military was as developed to the same sophistication as it had been in Persia, the Mediterranean, or China. But ultimately, the Iranians managed to pull things back together under Peroz. However, he was eventually captured by the Hephthalites, and in this time period there were major invasions by Hunnic peoples, as some might say, such as the Hephthalites and others. And these invasions went into Iran and into India, and of course into Europe, where you have the actual Huns in Europe, although the Huns had been around for some time earlier in Europe. And it's arguable exactly how closely these different peoples are related. However, Iran certainly did have a period in time when it was eventually briefly dominated by foreign powers. But ultimately, in this time period, I would say that this is the period of northern and southern dynasties in China. I would say that the Liu Song had the most power when Iran ran into trouble, and the Guptas were also being invaded at this time and were in decline. So while China was not united, arguably because none of the other major power centers in the world were united, half of China was more powerful than any other country at the time. So in the northern and southern dynasties, southern China began to be more developed, although it wouldn't really reach the same Sinicization and high development that it has today. Because historically speaking, until some point in the Middle Ages, northern China was significantly more developed economically and larger in population than the south. However, over time, this changed as a number of dynasties invested more heavily in development in the south, and also natural changes in population, etc. So the southern dynasties is one of the periods in history where this can really be said to have begun. So the Liu Song were dominant in southern China, and then the southern Qi dynasty and the southern Liang. But eventually, the Iranians would be more powerful because in this time period they were southern China had been developing significantly, but the Iranians had some trouble with foreigners. That's one way to put it. For example, the Hephthalites, the Kidarites, and other groups were invading Iran. And eventually, in this time period, they were fighting against the so-called Byzantines. They called themselves Romans for most of their history. So the East Romans, one might say. And when southern Liang ran into instability, and when Kavad managed to gain advantages in his war against Rome, it can be said that the Iranians became the most powerful in the world. And then under his successor Khosrow, this would continue. But eventually, I would say that the title of most powerful ruler in the world would necessarily have changed when the northern Zhou dynasty conquered northern Qi, uh, uniting northern China it more powerfully than it had been in quite some time. And of course, there was I think it was the Qin Dynasty in the south, but it was significantly smaller than the previous southern dynasties, as the northern dynasties had managed to chip away a lot of its territory. Uh, but eventually, the northern Zhou were overthrown by Emperor Wen of the Sui Dynasty, which unified China. However, they ultimately that didn't last long, as China eventually entered into civil war again. And during that time period, I would argue that Iran was the most powerful. Some people might say that the Byzantines would be. However, I would say that Iran was in a better position geographically, and was certainly matching the Eastern Romans in its military power. And even though the Eastern Romans managed to regain control of a lot of the Western Mediterranean, I would say that the Iranians still would be more powerful overall. Although I'm certain that that's a more controversial opinion here. But eventually, China was reunited by Gaozu of Tang, the Tang dynasty, as some might say. And this dynasty is a relatively powerful dynasty that had a lot of stability, although some of its rulers were deposed and had to abdicate or were assassinated. So maybe you can take that with a grain of salt. But for a brief time, Wu Zetian managed to establish her own Zhou dynasty. She had been uh, the wife of an emperor and then the mother of an emperor, but she ultimately assumed power herself until eventually the elites in China deposed her, and then the Tang Dynasty was reinstated. Although technically speaking, it wasn't a major dynastic shift. It's just simply that it's a different dynasty and they have a different name for their country. Now, while all this was happening in China, while the Tang Dynasty was enjoying very strong military dominance, conquering large parts of Central Asia and Northern Asia, and expanding into Korea and Vietnam, while this was going on, Islam had emerged in Arabia, and after the death of Muhammad, his successors took the title Caliph, which can be translated in a number of different ways. You could translate it as vice regent, vicar, uh, deputy, viceroy. But essentially, the idea is that the caliph holds, or the caliph holds a similar position as a similar political position as Muhammad did, but to a lesser degree. So they are successors of him, but are lesser in their authority and in their rule. So they are considered to be his deputies uh, in the power that they hold, so that it is lesser to his, because they think that Muhammad, of course, is a very important prophet to them, and they don't want to put themselves on the same level as him. So it has a similar but lesser dignity to Muhammad in that way. But there was the Rashidun caliphs and then the Umayyads, and they had expanded their empire not only over the Middle East but into Africa, parts of Europe, through Persia, and they were beginning to even take over some of the Western vassals away from the Tang. And they had some minor conflict in Central Asia with the Chinese. The Abbasids emerged to power eventually and managed to take over this empire, although they didn't manage to control as much of it. Now, the reason why I don't put the Umayyads on here as instead of the Tang is because I think that the Tang dynasty is economically more significant in this time period and has a lot more stability. But when there was a civil war in the Tang dynasty, I would say that the Abbasids eventually became significantly more powerful under Al-Mansur, who founded Baghdad, and Baghdad became a very important city and a very important center of learning. Now, it's worth noting that Baghdad was founded relatively close to some other previous capitals in the region. It was founded close to Ctesiphon, which was founded close to Seleucia, which was some distance away from Babylon. So it followed a similar center of power in central Mesopotamia, which in ancient times was known as Akkad. And from there, they ruled over a vast empire. Although eventually, a lot of their local rulers became significantly more independent, and their empire fragmented over time. However, I would say that when the Abbasids were entering a weaker period in their history, the Tang dynasty and the Tang had become more powerful again, the Tang dynasty would be more powerful. Eventually, the Tang dynasty, however, entered into a final phase of collapse. Multiple civil wars breaking out, and during this time period, the Abbasids were powerful, although they themselves were not as powerful as they had once been. So once northern China finally reunifies, because that's how weak the Abbasids were in the time period of Al-Muqtadir, a lot of their former vassals had gained functional independence, and their empire had been peeled back significantly, and pretty soon they would eventually be invaded by the Turks. But before this, I would say that northern China that unified would be more powerful. So this is the later Tang dynasty. No direct relation to the Tang other than the fact that they wanted to have a sense of legitimacy and continuity with them, saying that we are the legitimate successors to the Tang, even though we aren't actually related. But they were united by a powerful general. However, as you might see by some of the dates here, power changed relatively quickly, and pretty soon, I would argue that the Great Liao were the most powerful, as they had helped another dynasty overthrow the later Tang, and the Great Liao are from the so-called Eastern barbarians that were in that was one of the outer vassals of the Tang dynasty, and they were a more northerly people that were considered foreigners and outsiders and barbarians. However, they did manage to gain a brief dominance over northern China. However, that didn't last long, as northern China was retaken by the later Han Dynasty, and ultimately that dynasty was replaced by the Zhou Dynasty. And by the way, in this time period, I would say that the Middle East wasn't very unified. India had some kingdoms in it, but I would say that unified northern China would still be stronger. And I would generally say that this is a trend you'll see. The Chinese economy historically was one of the biggest in the world, and so it makes sense that even half of China is more powerful than most other countries. So the Zhou Dynasty was established in northern China, but ultimately the dynasty that unified China was the Song Dynasty. And the Song Dynasty is perhaps one of the greatest Chinese dynasties, although it might not be. I think it's somewhat underrated by some historians. But the Song Dynasty was a dynasty that was very powerful economically, perhaps not as well put together militarily as some of the previous Chinese dynasties, although they certainly still had a powerful military. Under the Song Dynasty, southern China essentially became what it is today. It became the more agriculturally prosperous, heavily developed region. And the Song Dynasty, I would say, is one of the most technologically advanced countries in history compared to other countries at the time. So I would say that they were certainly more technologically advanced than any other country at the time. And I would say that even after, somewhere in the middle, or perhaps a bit past the middle of their time span, half of their country was conquered by the Jurchens. So northern China was taken over. Even after that, in southern China, they were so prosperous and so well connected in trade, and they had such a strong industrial economy that they can still be considered the most powerful rulers in the world. That is the rulers of the Song Dynasty. And some might even argue that they were on the verge of an industrial revolution a few centuries early. But ultimately, that all ended with the Mongol conquest, not just of the Song Dynasty, but of other places. But in the 1220s, Genghis Khan or Chinggis Khan, another one of those individuals that can be argued to, as a single person, have done something significantly different and conquered a lot of places and changed history in huge ways. He conquered Khwarezmia, and for those of you who don't know what that is, Khwarezmia or Khwarezmia was a region in Central Asia that was very well developed economically at its time and became the center of an empire that ultimately conquered Persia, the Khwarezm Shahs, as they might be known to some. And 1221 is the year in which it can be said that they had fully conquered not only all of Central Asia, but they had conquered into Persia, and they were also well on their way to conquering northern China, that is the Mongols, which in just a few decades had gone from being several different tribes, with the Kamag Mongol being just one small tribal confederacy among them, to being united in a huge empire that conquered more land than any other previous empire, and also uh, managed to significantly damage large parts of the world, and and arguably repress culturally many places, such as China, but also Russia and the Middle East, as they had destroyed many agricultural canals and channels in Mesopotamia, essentially ruining the economy of Mesopotamia in large ways. Not also not and of course not only limited to that, but also in their conquest, the destruction of Baghdad, etc. So anyway, the Mongols under Genghis Khan and subsequent rulers had a huge influence on history, and however, he himself didn't manage to conquer a lot of the later things because he eventually died. And when he died, Tului assumed a regency over the empire until the Kurultai, which is in some ways like a parliament, managed to get together to elect a successor from among his sons. And that successor was Ögedei. And under Ögedei, the Mongols managed to conquer more parts of China, and also they went as far they went very far into Eastern Europe and were threatening to invade Western Europe. But then he died, so the leaders of the armies had to pull back to attend the Kurultai in order to elect a new successor, and from there on, Mongol expansion in Europe ended pretty much. Although they did control Russia, but ultimately, in this time period, they had become very prosperous. They had this huge empire that spanned the continent, and I think it's very impressive. So when Ögedei died, he was briefly, or actually for a few years, there was a regency of until Guyuk was elected. But and the reason why it took so long was because the empire was so large that in order to effectively gain a new ruler, it took a lot of time for people to get together, and then they had to deliberate, etc. So ultimately, after a few more rulers, the empire it had to devolve a lot of power to various sub kingdoms or khanates beneath it. So you have the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate, the Golden Horde, for example. And there were other smaller sub realms within all of these. For example, within the Ilkhanate was the Sultanate of Rum, and from there sprang the Ottomans eventually. But anyway, under eventually in 1259, Kurultai elected Arik Böke to be the Kagan, the ruler of the Mongols, but he was opposed by Kublai Khan, a relative of his, of course. And ultimately, Kublai Khan became dominant, but the empire became less united, and the more western parts of the empire became more independent in a number of ways, and the Mongol court in the east became more heavily influenced by Chinese culture. So Kublai Khan, for example, he began his own dynasty in China called the Great Yuan. And because of the very Chinese orientation, even though they were also very Mongol, I tend to use their Chinese names when I'm writing them here. But ultimately, after Kublai Khan, there were some competent successors, but there was a lot of palace intrigue and brief civil wars here and there, until eventually uh, uh, China had the Yellow Turban Rebellion and a major civil war against and a rebellion against the Mongols in various parts of China, and they had to ultimately retreat into Mongolia, where the Yuan dynasty would continue for quite some time, but they were no longer considered a Chinese dynasty at that point. But during the Yellow Turban Rebellion, when there was no dominant force in China, I had to ask myself who would be the most powerful in the world at that point. And some names came to mind. The Sultanate of Delhi in India, but the problem was it actually wasn't that strong in this time period and was running into a lot of trouble. A couple of other options emerged in the Egyptians under the Mamluks. However, at that time they were suffering under the Black Death, the plague had been spreading throughout many parts of the world, and that also includes Mali, which would have been my pick if Mali at this time had not been having major troubles under the bubonic plague. So, because Mali in this time period was very wealthy in copper, in gold, and in salt, in ivory, and also in slaves. And so their kings were extremely wealthy. However, because of the poor state that their country was in this time period, I had to pick someone else. And so what I ended up picking was Majapahit, which was a kingdom centered on the island of Java in today's Indonesia, which in this time period had been expanding significantly and had gained dominance over most of what we today call Indonesia, and therefore was also on the crucial sea-based trade route between China and India, which is one of the historically most important trade routes. And for this reason, Majapahit gets on here, and also because Chinese records, even though there weren't a lot of internal records from Majapahit for people to look at to ascertain its history, Chinese records at the time indicate that Majapahit had a very high economic prosperity and very high crop yields, which indicates that they certainly were very prosperous. So I put Majapahit on here. And also, the Mongols weren't able to conquer them, which is another significant thing. But ultimately, China managed to reunify under the Hongwu Emperor of the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty was a bit more conservative than the Song Dynasty, and therefore ended up not being as creative in a number of ways. However, it was still very strong economically and also very strong militarily. So, and relatively stable politically. Although there were some major events, for example, one emperor being captured by the Oirats, and so they had to put somebody else in, who eventually was deposed, and the original emperor was reinstated. So that's an interesting event in history. But the Ming Dynasty eventually ended up in some economic trouble, while at the same time, Spain and Portugal united under one ruler, King Philip the Second of Spain and First of Portugal. And I would say that at this point, that makes him the most powerful ruler in the world. The reason being that, for one, he had access to a lot of the world's silver, and there was a lot of gold mining. Although I will say that economically speaking, his kingdoms were not very strong economically, because in throughout this time period, Spain was constantly at war. However, Spain and Portugal both had somewhat lucrative colonies, especially Portugal, which was at this time period early on controlling the trade in the Indian Ocean. Now, under his successors, Philip and Philip, their situation would eventually degrade, because in the time period of Philip II, there was even a brief plan to invade and conquer China. Although I don't think that plan would have been very successful. I think that this does indicate that they had a significant amount of confidence, because they were, in 1580, the only two major colonial powers. Other countries were beginning to get involved, but they certainly weren't as big. They controlled a lot of trade on the Atlantic, the Indian, and practically all of the major trade going across the Pacific, in the case of the Spanish colonies. And they had even assigned themselves the exclusive right to colonize most of the world, which is pretty interesting looking historically at the Treaty of Tordesillas or whatever. But anyway, they had a naval dominance and a dominance in trade, and the decision of Philip III, or was it the Philip IV? I forget which one, not to allow the trading of silver to China put a huge squeeze on the Chinese economy. So even if the monarchs themselves weren't very prosperous, their empires, their empire, it arguably multiple, because technically speaking, there wasn't even a kingdom of Spain at this time, because it was the kingdom of Castile and the kingdom of Aragon, and they had their subrealms, and Portugal was also Portugal and the Algarve. So Spain was more of a geographical term in this time period. But despite their economic troubles and the fact that they didn't always win, they were able to effectively control very large parts of the world and rule them, perhaps not the most effectively, but effective enough to stop outsiders from taking what they had. So that's something to be said. But as this time period develops, eventually Spain, already in 1580, had to deal with a rebellion in the Netherlands. Then later on, they have to deal with the 30 Years' War on top of that. And Spain is involved in that to some extent. And they also have to deal with the rise of other colonial powers, such as France, England, and, of course, the Netherlands, that eventually challenged Spain and Portugal's dominance on the seas. And ultimately, Spain's endless wars against not only other European powers, but also against the Ottomans and various powers in Asia, ultimately puts Portugal at a disadvantage. And Portugal in this time period sees a bit of a decline in its colonial empire, although it still retains a lot of its territory. However, it is running into problems partially due to the trouble that Spain pulls Portugal into. So ultimately, in 1640, there is a rebellion in Portugal known as the Restoration War, where Portugal ends up selecting a king of its own instead of the Spanish successor. And there's also a rebellion in Catalonia as well, and a rebellion in southern Italy, which is another place that Spain was in control of. So there's multiple rebellions, and ultimately Portugal and its colonial empire break away from Spain, and the other colonial powers by this time period are finally catching up. So it can be said that while Spain, for some time, due to its union with Portugal, was the dominant power in the world, perhaps not in any one-to-one fight against China. I don't think that if Spain was attached to China's coast, for example, and they had a war that Spain would win, I don't think that would happen. But it's not all about direct military power or even proper economic sufficiency. There's also an element of having an advantageous position and being able to exploit advantages that you have that can lead to a country, to not only a country, but a country's rulers being put on this list. But anyway, once the personal union with Spain and Portugal ends, the question becomes, who is the most powerful in the world? And my answer is Shah Jahan, the king of the world, as the name implies. That's a translation. But anyway, the Mughals in India, they are related to the Timurids. I didn't put Tamerlane on here because I think China was more powerful in that time period. But ultimately, the Mughals end up having a major share of the world's not just agricultural, but industrial production, the production of industrial goods before the Industrial Revolution, that is. And although there is some trouble, by the way, in this time period is when the Taj Mahal is built in India. After Shah Jahan is deposed and replaced by Alamgir, or Aurangzeb as he might be known, the Mughals managed to conquer more of India, but despite their great power after the death of Aurangzeb, there is a succession crisis in the Mughal Empire, and they never really recover because then some parts of the empire start becoming more independent. The Marathas begin invading. There's invasions coming in from Afghanistan, and Delhi gets sacked. So there's a number of disasters that happen one after the other, but I think they can all be said to have started with the death of Aurangzeb, who arguably was one of our most powerful rulers and who expanded the empire to one of India's biggest empires. But the other major power in the world at the time would, of course, be the Great Qing, the Qing Dynasty. Their rulers were related in some ways to the Jurchen, who had previously invaded northern China, the Qing being closely related to them. And they were from the Manchu ethnicity that invaded China in the last days of the Ming Dynasty, and ultimately eventually managed to consolidate their power and expand Chinese territory to a very large extent. So they actually are one of the largest Chinese dynasties. Uh, and they had a reasonable amount of stability, but ultimately, at the end of the reign of the Qianlong Emperor, there are a couple of large rebellions. Although they succeed in putting down these rebellions, at the same time, the Western powers in Europe are entering into the Industrial Revolution. And after that point, the Qing Dynasty in China would, and also countries in India, would no longer be able to keep up with the European powers. Although by this point, throughout this time period that the Qing were prominent, Britain began taking over large parts of India through the British East India Company, and eventually under a more direct rule. But due to Britain's taking over of India and them slowly gaining advantages over China, and the fact that they would eventually take this advantage to win the First Opium War some years later, the United Kingdom, I would say, would be, under King George III, would be the most powerful in the world, despite the fact that in this time period, the American Revolution was happening, or had happened, and therefore they had lost one of their major colonies. I would say that they were still the most powerful in the world, because France, although it had been one of the major European powers, was in a real bad state economically and was going through the French Revolution, a period of great instability, although they were also very active militarily during that time as well. The Dutch were in a period of instability and were eventually taken over by the French. And Spain was also entering into a period of decline despite still having a lot of large colonies. So Britain at this point in time was entering into the Industrial Revolution. Germany hadn't really unified yet. Austria was not too strong. Russia was less developed than the more Western countries. So I would say that Britain, out of the whole world in this time period, was the most powerful. That is originally the Kingdom of Great Britain, eventually renamed to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland in this time period. Eventually, Northern Ireland several decades later. But at this point, Ireland was a united Ireland under the crown, as much as some people might like it or dislike it. But anyway, that's not what this video is about. So ultimately, Britain, though it was dominant, was somewhat overshadowed for a brief period by France under Napoleon. Because when Napoleon won the Battle of Austerlitz, and he had defeated Russia as well as Austria, he not only directly took a lot of territory for himself, but he also forced the other European countries to give a lot of concessions. So this begins a period of dominance in Europe, in an industrializing Europe, not fully industrialized yet, but industrializing, where France is dominant. France takes over Spain and the Netherlands and Italy and Germany for the most part, and is all around arguably the world's most powerful country, and it takes several other countries teaming up to beat France. Although France was not able to beat Britain on the seas, arguably France's dominance over the other European countries that in this time period are beginning to industrialize makes France the most powerful country. But eventually, Napoleon's fortunes turned around after the disastrous campaign in Russia and eventually losing the Battle of Leipzig. He ended up really not recovering at that point, and Britain from there on would be the dominant power in not only Europe but the whole world, having naval involvement pretty much everywhere, and entering into a rivalry with Russia and the emerging power of Germany. Although early on, in this time period, they're very friendly. It's only later on, towards the end, that they end up in a more hostile position. But anyway, that is to say, they were friendly with Prussia, but eventually, after the German unification and being friendly for some time period, then afterwards, they become more hostile in the reign of Wilhelm II of Germany, corresponding to the time period leading up to World War I. But anyway, the UK arguably is very prosperous and very powerful, and the United States is a rising power in this time period, but doesn't really have the same force projection as the UK does, and also doesn't have quite as large as an economy yet either. But anyway, George III, George the Fourth, King William IV, Queen Victoria, by some considered the peak of the British Empire, and ultimately Britain ends up in World War I, which heavily taxes the British economy to the point where they have to borrow a large amount of money from the United States. So arguably then, in the later period of World War I, the United States, which was less negatively affected economically by World War I than Britain and the other European powers, ends up becoming the dominant economic power and eventually the dominant military power following World War II. But in this time period, the secondary powers to the US's dominance would be Britain, Russia, or more accurately, the Soviet Union, and France. I would not say that Nazi Germany would be a major competitor, although briefly, perhaps in the peak of their power, they might be slightly competitive. I would also not say that for Imperial Japan. And the reason for this is because both of those countries were countries that were not expanding out of a position of strength, but rather they were expanding to reach a position of strength, as opposed to Britain, France, Russia, and the United States, which in World War II were countries that had the option of being more self-sufficient, even if they weren't always up to scratch militarily in certain situations. So, for example, the Nazi economy was heavily geared towards going to war, not because they had this idea of constant warfare like the Assyrians did, but more because they wanted to enter into a position where they could then, according to their ideology, enter perhaps into a more peace-like state. So for this reason, their economy in some ways can be considered a gamble, because they were making a short-term gamble on conquering a lot instead of investing more for the long term. But anyway, that's a more economic critique. But arguably the US, well, not arguably, I think it's easy to say that the United States was more powerful than the Soviet Union for a number of different reasons. Its economic power, for one, to the point that at some point they started sending grain to the Soviet Union. Uh, but also, there's the United States' ability to project force, uh, which was a bit more than the Soviet Union was able to. The United States and their navy were very prominent everywhere in the world, and they had and they still do have bases everywhere. Uh, the Soviet Union's arms race with the United States was interesting, where in some ways the United States was better representing their actual strength than the Soviet Union was. There are cases where the Soviet Union was over-representing their strength. So that may have led to some assumptions that the Soviet Union was stronger than the United States. However, their overwhelming power was more locally concentrated, I would argue. However, I say that the United States continued to be the most powerful country in the world, even after the fall of the Soviet Union, especially considering the United States' advantage in manufacturing post World War II that has been slowly declining, but also nowadays their advantage in the tech industry. And although China is nowadays a rising power, I would argue that the United States still is in a much stronger position economically, considering their stability and the potential threat of the middle income trap to China. And the United States also continues to be the country that is the most involved in the foreign affairs of other countries, especially militarily, with a second perhaps being Russia, and of course France and Britain also being involved to some extent. So the United States in the current time period, 2021, I would say, and 2022 going into that year, the United States can be considered the world hegemon in some sense, because the major international decisions of other countries and whether they want to go to war are all weighed under the question of what would the United States do in response to this. So, in that sense, all countries in the world have some interest in what the United States is doing, partially because of potential antagonism to the United States or from the United States, but also because of the fact that if you look at US aid, the United States gives some type of economic or military aid to most countries in the world. So the US is actually subsidizing most countries in the world in some ways. So in that sense, the United States and its presidents, starting with Woodrow Wilson and nowadays Joe Biden, and we're not going to talk about questions concerning this event, but the United States is nevertheless, regardless of its current political questions that it's running through and its economic troubles, still the most powerful country in the world, and therefore the President of the United States is the most powerful ruler in the world, at least in relation to his powers. But anyway, thank you all for watching. If you have differing opinions on different time periods on who should be considered the most powerful ruler or the most powerful country in the world, feel free to tell me. Thank you all for watching, and I will be seeing you all next time on Anavultus over and out.